Hi everyone, I'm Claire Holloway. This is my true story. The day my parents tried to sue me for my grandmother's entire fortune, and how the judge's one unexpected question froze the courtroom. The moment I stepped into that courtroom, my heart clenched. There they were, my parents, sitting in the front row, their faces radiating a calm confidence that chilled me to the bone. It was the same chilling composure they wore 25 years ago, the day they left me behind. But this time, they weren't just leaving. They were coming to take everything else. They looked utterly certain of the outcome. And why wouldn't they? To the outside world, my parents were picture-perfect, respected professionals, draped in polite manners and charitable appearances. People trusted them, believed them. And I was just the daughter they'd casually abandoned, the inconvenient truth they'd swept under the rug. But the circumstances had profoundly shifted. My grandmother, Margaret Holloway, the unwavering woman who became my whole world after they walked away, had passed. And in her final, decisive act, she left everything, her home, her investments, her savings, to me and me alone. Now, the very people who dropped me off at her doorstep in Laguna Beach, California, were suing me, demanding what they believed was rightfully theirs. I stood there, a strange stillness settling over me as the judge reviewed the file. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the faint rustle of papers, the distant hum of traffic outside. Then his eyes lifted. They lingered on me, a beat longer than expected. "Excuse me," he said, slowly, his gaze narrowing. "Were you raised by Margaret Holloway?" That question landed like a fault line cracking open beneath us. Across the aisle, my parents stiffened. Their carefully constructed certainty wavered, just for a fleeting moment, because in that instant I knew something they didn't. This case wasn't about to unfold the way they had meticulously planned. Whatever polished story they'd prepared about the past, the court was about to hear a very different one. The judge's question hung in the air, a silent accusation. I felt my parents shift beside each other, a subtle movement that most wouldn't notice. But I had learned long ago to recognize discomfort in the smallest gestures. Silence, my grandmother had always said, trains you well. "Yes, Your Honor," I answered, my voice quiet but firm. She raised me. The judge nodded once, as if confirming a suspicion he'd held all along. Then he looked back down at the file, and the room seemed to collectively exhale. That simple question, so direct, so pointed, pulled me backward, far from the polished courtroom, far from Orange County, back to a quiet afternoon in Laguna Beach, when I was only 6 years old and didn't yet understand what leaving truly meant. The sky had been a cruel, brilliant blue that day, too bright, too clean for the ache forming in my small chest. My parents' car idled in the driveway of a modest coastal house, its engine humming impatiently. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and eucalyptus, but all I could smell was the exhaust. My mother adjusted the strap of my tiny backpack, the gesture almost clinical, as if she were simply sending me off to school. "Be good for Grandma Margaret," she said lightly, that casual tone already a lie. "We'll come get you soon." Soon was a word I would learn to mistrust, a hollow promise that echoed for years. My father stood by the car, already checking his watch, his impatience a palpable force. "We'll be late," he muttered, half turned towards the driver's seat. "Late for what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. No one answered. My mother leaned in, kissing the air near my cheek, close enough to count, far enough to avoid true contact. Then she stepped back. The door clicked shut. Gravel crunched beneath the tires as the car reversed, turned, and disappeared down the hill. I stood there, rooted to the spot, long after the sound faded completely. The front door opened behind me. My grandmother, Margaret Holloway, didn't rush. She never rushed. She placed a hand gently on my shoulder, her touch a warmth I hadn't realized I was craving. She said nothing at first, her silence different from my parents'. It didn't demand. It didn't escape. They didn't explain. I whispered, the words catching in my throat. She sighed softly. "No," she said. "They rarely do." That night, she made soup from scratch, letting me stir the pot until my small arm grew tired. Later, she tucked me into the small guest bedroom that would quietly, surely, become mine, smoothing the sheets as if she had always known I would be there. "Will they come back?" I asked, my voice small, vulnerable. Margaret sat beside the bed for a long moment before answering. "Some people leave because they don't know how to stay," she said, her voice soft but firm. "That isn't your fault." It was the first time anyone had ever said that to me, And the weight of those words stayed with me. Life with my grandmother settled into a rhythm that felt deliberate, intentional. She woke early. She read the newspaper front to back, believing that if something truly mattered, it deserved attention, not urgency. Every morning, she would point to a headline and ask, "What do you think they're leaving out?" At first, I didn't understand, but she was endlessly patient. She let me answer incorrectly. She let me think out loud. Margaret Holloway had been a probate attorney for over 30 years. She believed in records, in clarity, in saying exactly what you meant before someone else decided to say it for you. Memory is unreliable, she used to say. Paper is not. When I was 12, she showed me how to organize files with meticulous precision. When I was 15, she taught me how to read legal language without being intimidated by its jargon. And when I was 17, she gave me a leather-bound notebook. "For your own words," she said. "One day, someone may try to tell your story for you." My parents never visited. They sent cards sometimes, holidays, birthdays, carefully worded, emotionally distant, always signed together, never personal enough to reply to. I stopped waiting. The years passed quietly. I went to college nearby, coming home on weekends. Margaret grew older, her mind never slowing. She kept meticulous notes, even about ordinary conversations. When she fell ill, it was sudden but not chaotic. She organized everything herself. Doctors, documents, instructions. And when she died, the house felt unbearably, profoundly still. At the reading of the will, my parents sat straight-backed and expectant, their posture practically screaming entitlement. Then the attorney read it. Margaret Holloway left her entire estate to her granddaughter. Not a portion, not a trust, everything. That was when their practiced silence turned hostile. By the way, if you're still with me, witnessing this unbelievable journey, make sure to hit that subscribe button. More stories, even more astonishing than this one, are coming your way. Now, standing in a courtroom decades later, I looked at my parents across the aisle. People who had once left me on a driveway with a backpack and a promise they never kept. They saw money. I saw the woman who had stayed. And as the judge prepared to hear the case, I understood something with unsettling clarity. This wasn't truly about inheritance. It was about which version of the past would be allowed to exist. And this time, I wasn't the child being spoken for. I was ready to speak for myself. After the will reading, my parents didn't approach me. They didn't argue. They didn't raise their voices. They simply exchanged a glance, brief, practiced, full of unspoken intent, and left the room without a word. That silence carried more menace than any confrontation could have. Margaret's attorney, Daniel Brooks, lingered behind as the others filed out. He adjusted his glasses and looked at me with something close to sympathy. "She anticipated this," he said quietly. "Anticipated what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer, that they wouldn't accept her decision. In the weeks that followed, I learned what my grandmother had spent decades preparing for. Margaret's home in Laguna Beach was modest by coastal standards, but every drawer held order. Every folder had a purpose. Deeds, correspondence, handwritten notes, all dated, all precise. She had lived the way she practiced law, with absolute clarity. One afternoon, while sorting through a filing cabinet in her study, I found a folder labeled Personal Reflections. Inside were pages written in her familiar, deliberate script. "My children believe time entitles them to forgiveness." One entry read, "Time entitles no one to anything. Only responsibility does." Another, written years later, "If they ever challenge this will, it will not be because they were excluded. It will be because they were confronted by consequence." Reading her words didn't make me angry. It steadied me. I met with Daniel again a few days later. He spread documents across the dining table. Medical evaluations, witness statements, drafts of earlier wills. "She revised this will 3 times, he explained. Each revision reaffirmed the same intent. "Did she ever doubt it?" I asked. "Never," he said. "If anything, she became more certain." The lawsuit arrived 2 days later. It came by certified mail, addressed formally, impersonally. Notice of probate litigation. Plaintiffs Eleanor and Richard Holloway. My parents were claiming undue influence, isolation, diminished capacity. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so predictable. Daniel called immediately. "They filed in Orange County Superior Court," he said. "They're alleging you manipulated her." I closed my eyes. "She taught me how to document manipulation," I replied. "That may be the most useful thing she ever did." The media interest followed quickly, not aggressively, but persistently. Headlines framed it as a family dispute, softening the edges. People, I suppose, prefer ambiguity when truth feels uncomfortable. At the first preliminary hearing, My parents sat across from me, their expressions carefully neutral. Their attorney, Michael Grant, spoke with practiced confidence. "Your Honor," he began, "this case involves an elderly woman whose declining health made her vulnerable to suggestion." Margaret would have absolutely hated that sentence. When Daniel responded, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue emotion. "Margaret Holloway practiced probate law for 3 decades, he said calmly. She documented every major decision. Her medical records show full cognitive capacity. Her correspondence shows consistent intent." The judge listened without expression. That night, back at the house, I opened the leather notebook Margaret had given me years ago. I hadn't written in it for a long time. I turned to a blank page and wrote only one line. "Truth doesn't need urgency. It needs record." As the days passed, I felt the familiar tension begin to form, the kind that comes when people try to rewrite something that was never ambiguous. But this time, it didn't hollow me out. It sharpened me. Margaret hadn't raised me to defend myself loudly. She had raised me to remain precise. Standing at the edge of the case now, I understood what she had truly left me. Not just a home, not just savings, but the foresight to know that when the past is challenged, facts must be ready to speak before emotions do. And soon, very soon, the court would begin listening. The formal hearings began on a Monday morning, the kind that felt too ordinary for what it carried. Outside the Orange County Superior Court, a small cluster of reporters waited, their presence polite but persistent. No one shouted, no one rushed forward. Cameras lifted quietly as I walked past, their lenses following me with restrained curiosity. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. My parents sat at the plaintiff's table, angled slightly toward each other, their posture practiced, composed. They didn't look at me. They didn't need to. Their attorney, Michael Grant, leaned close, speaking in a low voice, his confidence steady. Judge Alan Reeves entered precisely on time. The room rose, then settled into silence. Michael Grant stood first. "Your Honor," he began, "this case concerns a vulnerable elderly woman whose declining health made her susceptible to undue influence by the defendant." The words landed exactly as intended, measured, clinical, persuasive. He spoke of proximity, of dependence, of a granddaughter who lived with her grandmother and benefited from it. Margaret's name was used carefully, almost gently. I felt something tighten in my chest, not anger, but a deep recognition. This was the version of the story they had always preferred, the one where responsibility dissolved into circumstance. When Daniel Brooks rose, he did so without urgency. "Your Honor," he said evenly, "this court will see extensive documentation showing Margaret Holloway's consistent intent over many years." He placed the first set of exhibits before the clerk. The sound of paper sliding across would felt louder than it should have. The first witness was a former caregiver. "Yes," she testified, "Margaret relied on her granddaughter for daily matters." Michael Grant stepped forward smoothly, including controlling visitors. The witness hesitated. "She coordinated schedules, which meant deciding who saw her." Michael pressed. Daniel stood. "Objection. Assumes control rather than coordination." Sustained. Judge Reeves said calmly. Daniel approached the witness. "Did Margaret Holloway ever instruct you to restrict visits against her wishes?" "No," the woman answered. "She was very clear about who she wanted to see." Michael frowned slightly. The next exhibits focused on medical evaluations. Charts appeared on the screen, dates, signatures, assessments. "Advanced age," Michael said. "Chronic illness." Daniel responded without raising his voice. "Comprehensive cognitive evaluations conducted within 6 months of the will revision. All indicate full capacity." Judge Reeves leaned forward, studying the screen. "Then my mother was called." She walked to the stand carefully, her expression already softened into a mask of vulnerability. She spoke of regret, of distance, of wanting to reconnect before it was too late. "We tried," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly, "but we were pushed away." The room felt very, very still. Daniel rose slowly. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, "do you recall sending this message?" The screen lit up with an email. "We are willing to reconnect, but we need to discuss the estate." The date glowed beneath it. My mother's jaw tightened. That was misunderstood. Daniel nodded once. "Margaret responded the same day, asking you not to contact her again about financial matters." Silence. Judge Reeves made a note. By the afternoon recess, the courtroom felt different, less charged, more focused. The sharp edges of the narrative were beginning to emerge. During the break, my father passed me in the hallway. "You didn't have to take everything," he said quietly, his voice low, laced with resentment. I met his eyes. She decided what belonged where. That night, Back at the house, I sat in Margaret's study and opened her notebook again. Not the legal files, but her personal notes. One line stood out, written years earlier. When people speak loudly, listen to what they're trying not to say. I closed the book. Tomorrow, I would take the stand. And for the first time since this began, I felt ready. Not to defend myself, but to tell the truth exactly as it was, quietly, precisely, without asking for permission. I took the stand the following morning. The courtroom felt smaller, somehow, than it had the day before, as if the walls had inched closer overnight. Judge Alan Reeves watched quietly as I was sworn in. His expression was neutral, attentive, the kind that didn't invite performance, only honesty. Daniel Brooks began gently. "Can you state your name for the record?" "Yes," I said. "My name is Claire Holloway." Michael Grant's head lifted slightly. It was the first time he had looked directly at me. "Claire," Daniel continued, "how long did you live with your grandmother?" "Since I was 6 years old," I replied, "until the day she passed." "And during that time," he asked, "did she ever express uncertainty about her estate plans?" "No," I said. "She was very clear, repeatedly." Daniel nodded. "Did she discuss those plans with you?" "Yes," I said, "but not for advice. She informed me after decisions were made." Michael Grant rose smoothly. "Miss Holloway," he said, pacing slowly, "isn't it true that you depended on your grandmother financially?" "I was a minor," I replied evenly. "She was my guardian. And later, I supported myself." He smiled faintly. "But you lived in her home, benefited from her resources." "I lived where she asked me to live," I said, "and I contributed where I could." Michael stopped pacing. "Isn't it possible that your closeness influenced her decisions?" I didn't hesitate. Influence requires persuasion. She didn't ask for mine. A murmur passed through the room. Michael shifted tactics. "Did you ever limit your parents' access to her?" "No," I said. "She did." He raised an eyebrow. Convenient distinction. Judge Reeves' voice cut in. "Counsel." Michael nodded and adjusted his tie. "Let's be specific. Did you ever intercept calls?" "No." "Did you ever withhold mail?" "No." "Did you ever suggest she revise her will?" "No." Michael paused, then leaned closer to the rail. "You benefited significantly from her death, didn't you?" I met his gaze calmly. "I benefited from her life." The room fell silent. Daniel stood again. "Claire, why do you believe your grandmother left her estate to you?" I took a breath. "Because she believed responsibility should follow presence. She raised me. She trusted me." Michael scoffed softly. "Trust isn't legal proof." Daniel turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, the defense would like to introduce Margaret Holloway's personal correspondence." Folders were passed forward. Daniel read aloud. "I am not confused. I am not pressured. I am precise." Michael objected. "These are personal writings." Judge Reeves looked at the documents, then back at Michael. "They are contemporaneous records." Overruled. Daniel continued. "My granddaughter has never asked me for anything. That is precisely why I trust her with everything." I felt my throat tighten, not with grief, but recognition. Michael stood abruptly. "Your Honor, emotional language does not equate to legal intent." Judge Reeves' gaze sharpened. "Intent is exactly what this court is examining." Michael sat. The final question came quietly. Daniel asked, "Claire, did your grandmother ever fear this challenge?" I nodded once. "Yes." "What did she say?" "She said, people who abandon responsibility often return only when consequences arrive." No one spoke. Judge Reeves looked down at his notes, then back up at me. "You may step down." As I returned to my seat, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not relief, not victory, completion. During recess, my mother passed me in the hallway. "You didn't have to make us look like this," she said under her breath, her voice tight with suppressed fury. I stopped. "I didn't. The record did." That night, I sat alone in the house overlooking the ocean, the same house my grandmother had chosen deliberately. I didn't open her files. I didn't reread her notes. I simply stood by the window and watched the tide move in and out, steady and uninterested in human disputes. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, but the truth had already spoken, quietly, clearly on the record. The final day of testimony arrived with a stillness that felt deliberate. The courtroom filled more slowly than before, as if everyone understood there would be no new surprises, only consequences. My parents sat side by side at the plaintiff's table, closer than they had been all week. Their confidence had thinned into something brittle, careful. Michael Grant reviewed his notes repeatedly, tapping his pen against the table as if repetition might change what had already been said. Judge Alan Reeves entered without ceremony. "We will proceed with closing testimony, counsel." Michael stood first. "Your Honor," he began, "this case is not about documentation alone. It is about emotional dependence, about a young woman who became the center of an elderly woman's life." He turned slightly toward me. "Proximity creates influence." The phrase hung there, tidy and plausible. Daniel Brooks waited until Michael finished, then rose. "Your Honor," he said evenly, "proximity can also create responsibility." He placed a final exhibit beneath the document camera. A letter, handwritten, dated 6 weeks before my grandmother's death. Judge Reeves leaned forward. Daniel read aloud. "I am aware that my decisions may be challenged. That does not make them uncertain. I leave my estate to my granddaughter because she has been present without condition. She has stayed without expectation." My mother shifted sharply in her seat. Daniel continued, "This is not exclusion. It is consequence." Michael objected. "These writings are emotional reflections, not legal instruments." Judge Reeves responded without looking up. "They speak directly to intent." Overruled. The final witness was brief. A retired colleague of my grandmother's from the probate court. Margaret Holloway was meticulous, he testified. If anything, she anticipated disputes. She documented her decisions precisely to prevent them. Michael attempted one last angle. "Isn't it possible," he asked, "that made her more rigid?" The witness met his gaze calmly. Conviction and rigidity are not the same. By early afternoon, the courtroom felt settled, as if the arguments had reached their natural limit. Judge Reeves glanced at both tables. "Closing arguments, counsel." Michael's voice was quieter now, his words chosen with restraint. He spoke of family fractures, of regret, of how time could distort memory and isolate intention. Daniel stood last. "This case," he said, "is not about forgiveness. It is about autonomy." Margaret Holloway exercised hers clearly, consistently, and with full capacity. He gestured briefly toward me. She did not leave her estate to Claire because she was persuaded. She did so because Claire remained without demand, without condition. Judge Reeves listened without interruption. When the gavel struck to adjourn for deliberation, no one moved immediately. The sound echoed once, then disappeared. In the hallway, my father approached me. His voice was low, controlled. "You didn't have to take everything," he said. I met his eyes. She decided what belonged where. He looked away. That evening, back at the house, I didn't open any files. I didn't replay testimony in my head. I walked through the room slowly, touching familiar surfaces: the banister, the door frame, the edge of the desk where my grandmother had once sat and written. I thought about how carefully she had lived, how deliberately she had prepared, not for conflict, but for clarity. I sat in the study and opened the leather notebook she had given me years earlier. I turned to the last page and read the final line she had written there: "When the truth is tested, stand still. Let it speak." I closed the notebook and rested my hands on it, feeling the weight of it settle, not as burden, but as grounding. Tomorrow the court would speak, but tonight I understood something with calm certainty. No matter the ruling, the record existed, and once truth is recorded clearly, consistently, it does not disappear. It waits. The ruling was scheduled for 9 a.m. No cameras were allowed inside that morning. No murmurs from the gallery, just the muted sounds of a courthouse beginning its day. Footsteps on tile, the low rustle of paper, the distant closing of doors. I arrived early and took my seat without speaking. My parents entered a few minutes later. They didn't look at me. They sat stiffly, hands folded, as if posture alone could hold the outcome in place. Judge Alan Reeves entered precisely on time. The room rose, then settled. He adjusted his glasses, reviewed the documents before him one final time, and looked up. "This court has reviewed all testimony, exhibits, correspondence, and medical evaluations," he began. "The issue before us is whether Margaret Holloway executed her final will under undue influence." His voice was steady, unembellished. "The plaintiffs argue vulnerability," he continued. "They argue emotional dependence and isolation." He paused, letting the words hang. "The evidence does not support those claims." I felt my breath slow, each inhale measured. "What the record shows instead," Judge Reeves said, "is a pattern of consistent intent expressed over many years." The decedent demonstrated full mental capacity and deliberate judgment. My mother's fingers tightened around each other. "Affection does not constitute coercion," the judge continued. "Presence does not negate autonomy. and proximity alone does not establish undue influence. He looked down briefly, then back up. This court finds that Margaret Holloway acted freely, knowingly, and with clear intent. The words landed with quiet finality. The plaintiff's claims are dismissed in full. No one moved. The will stands, Judge Reeves said. The estate belongs to Claire Holloway. The gavel struck once. That is the order of this court. My father's shoulders sagged, as if something essential had slipped loose inside him. My mother stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable, almost hollow. Daniel Brooks placed a hand lightly on my arm. I nodded, but didn't speak. As we rose to leave, my mother reached out and caught my sleeve. "You think this makes you right?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, laced with a familiar bitterness. "You'll regret this." I met her eyes, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. She was right, I said quietly. That's what matters. I stepped away. Outside, the air felt cooler than it had in weeks. There were no reporters waiting, no microphones raised, just the courthouse steps, unchanged and indifferent. Daniel spoke briefly. "You handled yourself well. I learned from her," I said. Back at the house in Laguna Beach, the verdict papers rested neatly on the desk in my grandmother's study. I stood there for a long time, listening to the ocean beyond the windows, steady and unchanged. "You planned for this," I said softly, addressing the empty room. "Every part of it." That evening, I walked along the shoreline alone. The tide moved in and out without urgency. The same sound it had made the day my parents left me at her door. The same sound it made now. Only my understanding of it had changed. Justice hadn't arrived loudly. It had arrived precisely. And as the sun dipped toward the horizon, I realized something that settled into me with quiet certainty. The court had spoken, but my grandmother had already settled this long ago by teaching me how to stand still when the truth was questioned. And that lesson, unlike property or money, could never be taken away. The days that followed did not rush forward the way I expected them to. There were no sudden changes, no dramatic shifts in the rhythm of life. The house in Laguna Beach remained exactly as it had been. Windows facing the sea, floors worn smooth by years of quiet footsteps, the faint scent of salt carried in by the wind. What had changed was the silence. It was no longer tense. It no longer waited for something to happen. It simply existed. Daniel called once more, brief and professional. "The judgment is final. There will be no appeal." "Thank you," I said, and meant more than the words could hold. When the call ended, I stood alone in the kitchen, aware of something I hadn't felt in years. There was no next step waiting to be taken, no defense to prepare, no accusation hovering at the edges of my thoughts. That afternoon, I opened the drawers in my grandmother's study, not to search for documents, but to put them away. Files slid back into place. Envelopes were stacked neatly. The meticulous order she had lived by felt less like preparation now, and more like reassurance. She had trusted the record to hold. As evening settled, I took a walk along the beach. The sand was cool beneath my feet, the waves steady and unhurried. I remembered walking this same stretch as a child, my grandmother beside me, pointing out shells half buried in the sand. "Some things," she used to say, "don't disappear. They just wait until you're ready to see them." My phone rang as the sky darkened. It was my father. I stood there for a long moment before answering. "I read her letters," he said quietly when I finally picked up. His voice sounded smaller than I remembered. "All of them." I said nothing. "She wrote that I stopped being her son long before the will." He continued, the words heavy. "That I chose convenience over responsibility." The words hung between us, heavy but strangely calm. "She also wrote," I said evenly, "that it's never too late to face the truth." There was a long pause, then a breath. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I just needed you to know. I'm sorry." I watched the tide roll in, erase its own edge, then retreat again. "I don't know what forgiveness looks like yet," I said. "But pretending nothing happened, isn't it?" "I understand," he replied. When the call ended, I didn't feel relief. I felt space. Not emptiness, space. That night, I returned to the study and took out the leather notebook my grandmother had given me years ago. I hadn't opened it since the verdict. The pages were familiar, her handwriting steady and deliberate. I turned to an entry dated long before she was ill. "When truth is finally spoken, quiet becomes necessary. Don't rush to fill it." I closed the notebook and let the quiet stay. In the days that followed, People began to reach out. Not reporters, not attorneys, but those who had worked with my grandmother over the years, former colleagues, community members, people who had relied on her guidance and now wondered what would happen next. I listened more than I spoke. At the first meeting regarding her foundation, someone asked gently, "Do you plan to change anything?" "Not yet," I said. No one argued. One evening, as I moved through the house, turning off lights, I paused in the doorway of the study. The desk was clear now, the chair pushed in. Nothing demanded attention. For the first time, the house felt less like a record of the past and more like a place that could hold something new. The case had clarified what my parents had taken and what they hadn't. They had taken time. They had taken certainty, but they hadn't taken what mattered. Standing there, listening to the ocean beyond the windows, I understood something that settled into me without resistance. Winning the case hadn't filled the absence they left. It had simply named it, and naming it accurately, without distortion, was the first step toward deciding what came next. The weeks that followed settled into a quieter pattern than I had imagined. There were no more court dates to circle on the calendar, no legal language to translate into something human. Mornings arrived without urgency. Evenings closed without unfinished sentences hanging in the air. I began sorting through my grandmother's papers again, this time without purpose, not as preparation, not as defense, simply as a way of understanding the life she had lived once it no longer needed to be explained. Most of what I found was ordinary. Receipts, old correspondence, notes written in the margins of books she had read more than once. But threaded through everything was the same intention I had known all my life: clarity over comfort. One afternoon, tucked inside a folder labeled Personal, I found an envelope addressed to me in her handwriting. No date, no instruction. Inside was a single page. "Claire, if you are reading this, it means the noise has finally passed. Don't mistake quiet for emptiness. Quiet is where choice begins." I sat there longer than I meant to, the paper resting lightly between my fingers. That evening, I attended my first meeting with the board overseeing the foundation my grandmother had built. The room was small, the chairs mismatched. No one rushed to speak. "I'm not here to replace her," I said when they finally looked to me. "I'm here to continue what she believed mattered." No one disagreed. In the days that followed, I visited the places she had quietly supported for years: a community legal clinic, a scholarship program she had funded anonymously, a local library where she had donated not just books but time. At one clinic, a volunteer looked up from her desk and paused when she saw me. "You're Margaret Holloway's granddaughter," she said softly. I nodded. "She used to say, 'People don't need to be rescued,'" the woman continued. "They need to be respected." I smiled. That sounds like her. As autumn edged closer, the house began to feel different. Not lighter, exactly, more alive. I moved a chair to catch the afternoon sun. Opened windows that had stayed shut through the trial, let the sound of the ocean fill rooms that had been too quiet for too long. None of it felt like erasing her. It felt like continuing. The past still surfaced in unexpected ways. A phrase, a smell. The sound of gravel under tires could still tighten something in my chest before I realized why. But the memories no longer demanded answers. They simply existed. A letter arrived from my mother near the end of the month. Short, careful, polite. She wrote about regret without naming it, about distance without crossing it. I read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer. Not everything needed a reply. One evening I walked down to the shoreline as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The sky softened into layers of gray and gold. The ocean breathed steadily below, unchanged by inheritance or verdicts. I thought about the child I had been, the one who believed survival meant endurance, staying quiet, staying small. That child had done her job. She had kept me safe long enough to grow into someone who could choose. I returned to the house and took out the leather notebook one last time. I flipped through its pages slowly, not searching for guidance, not looking for proof. My grandmother's words no longer felt like instructions. They felt like confirmation. I closed the notebook and rested it on the table beside me. The fight was over. The story wasn't. But whatever came next would not be shaped by fear or by the need to justify a past that had already been recorded clearly. Standing there, listening to the ocean move in the dark, I understood something that settled into me with quiet certainty. The past no longer needed defending, and the future, for the first time, felt open. The notice arrived on a morning that felt unremarkable. A thin envelope slipped through the mail slot carrying the seal of the Orange County Superior Court. Inside was a single page, confirming what had already become clear in every practical sense. The case was officially closed. No appeals filed, no motions pending, nothing left to contest. I read it once and set it aside. It didn't feel like an ending. It felt like confirmation. That afternoon, I drove into town alone. Laguna Beach moved at its familiar pace, unhurried, coastal, uninterested in anyone else's resolution. Cafes filled and emptied. Dogs slept beneath tables. No one recognized me. No one asked questions. For the first time in months, my last name carried no weight here. I walked down to the pier and leaned against the railing, watching the water stretch endlessly ahead. My grandmother used to bring me here when I was younger. She rarely spoke during those visits. She said the ocean was useful that way. It didn't care what story you told yourself. You can't negotiate with what keeps moving, she once said. You can only decide where you stand. I thought about the child I had been, standing in a driveway with a backpack and a promise that never returned. I remembered believing that if I waited long enough, if I stayed still enough, someone would come back and explain everything. They never had. And standing here now, older, steadier, I understood something that didn't arrive with anger or accusation. They never intended to. The realization didn't hollow me out. It simplified things, like setting down something heavy you hadn't realized you were still carrying. When I returned to the house, Daniel Brooks was waiting in the study. He had stopped by to deliver the final documents in person, though we both knew they could have been mailed. "This closes it," he said, placing the folder on the desk. "Legally." I nodded. "Thank you." He hesitated, then added, "Some people will say you were fortunate." I met his eyes. Fortune doesn't document itself for decades. He smiled faintly. "No, it doesn't." After he left, I opened the leather notebook again, not to read, but to feel its weight. The pages were worn now, softened by years of turning. I ran my fingers along the margin of a familiar entry and thought about how many evenings my grandmother must have sat exactly where I was, writing, not because she feared the future, but because she believed in record overreaction. That evening, my phone rang. I saw my mother's name on the screen and let it ring. Not out of cruelty, not out of fear, but because I finally understood that some conversations arrive too late to change what they're meant to repair. Silence, I was learning, wasn't avoidance. It was clarity. As night settled over the house, I sat at the kitchen table where my grandmother and I had shared countless quiet mornings. I imagined her across from me, newspaper folded neatly, coffee cooling beside her hand. "What aren't they saying?" she would have asked. I smiled softly. They weren't saying that the case hadn't changed me. It had revealed me. I wasn't the child they left behind. I wasn't the defendant they tried to dismantle. I was the person she had trusted to hold the truth when it mattered. Before heading upstairs, I placed the notebook back on the shelf, not hidden, not displayed, exactly where it belonged. Outside, the ocean whispered against the shore, steady and indifferent. The same sound it had made the day my parents left. The same sound it made the day the court ruled. Only now it no longer felt like something was being taken from me. It felt like something had finally been returned. My footing, my direction, my choice to stop waiting for explanations that would never come. And as the lights dimmed and the house settled into its familiar quiet, I knew there was only one part of this story left to tell. Not about courts, not about inheritance, but about what happens when you stop waiting for the past to change and allow yourself to move forward without it. The morning came quietly. Light filtered through the curtains of the house overlooking the sea, soft and unhurried. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment before doing anything else, listening to the familiar sounds, the low hum of the refrigerator, the distant waves breaking below the cliffs, the gentle creak of the floor as the house woke with the day. Nothing was waiting for me anymore. I made coffee and sat at the table where my grandmother used to read the paper. The chair across from me empty, but not accusing. It felt complete, like a thought that had finally finished forming. For years, I believed justice would arrive loudly, that there would be a moment when everything aligned and the past loosened its grip all at once. But justice had come differently. It had arrived as permission. The permission to stop explaining, the permission to stop defending, the permission to let the past remain exactly what it was, unchanged, but no longer in control. Later that day, I walked down toward the cliffs, the wind steady at my back. The ocean stretched endlessly below, unconcerned with names, money, or verdicts. My grandmother loved that about it. She said it reminded her that certainty was often overrated. You don't need to be right forever, she once told me. You just need to be honest when it matters. I thought about how much of my life had been shaped by waiting for my parents to come back, waiting for explanations, waiting for something to feel resolved. Standing there now, I understood something with calm clarity. Nothing else was coming, and that was all right. That evening, I returned to the study one last time. I didn't rearrange anything. I didn't remove her belongings. I simply acknowledged them. The books she loved, the files she had kept, the careful order she had left behind. I took the leather notebook from the shelf and opened it, not to read, but to place one final page inside, a blank sheet, except for a single sentence I had written myself. The truth stood when it was tested. I closed the notebook and returned it to its place. Forgiveness, I had learned, was not a finish line. It wasn't something that appeared neatly after justice was served. Sometimes it was only the decision not to reopen a wound that had already stopped bleeding. I didn't forgive my parents that night, but I released the need to be understood by them, and that was enough. As the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, I stepped outside into the garden. The air was cool, grounding. Somewhere nearby, the roses my grandmother had planted years ago moved gently in the breeze. I realized then what she had truly left me. Not wealth, not protection from loss, but the ability to live without chasing the approval of those who had already chosen to leave. Inside, the house settled into its familiar quiet. I turned off the lights one by one and paused at the doorway, taking in the space, not as something I had inherited, but as something I could now inhabit fully. The story had ended where it was always meant to, not with reconciliation, not with celebration, but with release. And if anyone ever asked me what I gained from the trial, from the inheritance, from the long, difficult unraveling of my family's past, I would know exactly how to answer. I gained the courage to stop waiting for people to change. I gained the clarity to move forward without needing their permission. I gained my life back. The ocean whispered below, steady, as ever. And for the first time, I didn't listen for echoes. I listened to myself. And that was enough. This whole journey taught me so much about what truly matters. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to stand up for your truth, even when it meant facing down your own family? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I really want to know.